Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this revolution. I'm just going to give everyone just a couple more seconds to connect to the audio and get maybe their camera situated. All right, thank you so much. So I'm quickly just going to go over some Zoom functions. So to the bottom left of your screen, you have the mute and stop video buttons. If it's highly encouraged to have your camera on. Of course, we do understand if you're busy, you're just calling in or whatever the case may be, but it does make everyone a little bit more comfortable to share if there's, faces that you can see. We do have towards the center of the bottom of the screen, the chat function. And then more towards the bottom right, you see the reaction. So if you want to give some clapping hands or a heart to what someone's saying, that's highly encouraged as well. I will turn on the transcript in just a second once I'm done speaking. So you'll see that box pop up. If at any point the box is covering someone's face, you can move the box around on the screen. And then lastly, the top right corner of the screen, you can change the view. So I have a gallery so I can see everyone in the meeting. But if you'd like to just see who's speaking one at a time, you can change it to speaker. And I believe that's all the Zoom functions. So I'm going to pass it over to one of our facilitators tonight, Melanie Lopez.
Hello from Tucson, Arizona, the Autumn Druid. No Melody on Matsiwa. My name is Melanie Lopez. I'm Hopi Navajo and Pueblo. I got my master's in social welfare from UC Berkeley a few decades ago. And I'm happy to be a co-facilitator this evening. And we have a great topic. And it's really exciting for me because I'm co-facilitating today with a wonderful professional who I met because they were my intern and now they're my colleague. And sometimes I'd say even my boss in some ways. So Kelly, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. She'e Kelly Ray Vayo Yenshie. Twitch eating shlong, Jonah Edne, Bushes Chin, Deshchini, Dashache, Kohni, Dene, Dashanele. So I just introduced myself in my language. I am half Navajo, half Acoma Pueblo. I am a Bitterwater clan born for the Sun People clan. My maternal clan is the start of the Red Streak people, and my paternal clan is the Acoma Pueblo. So I am half Navajo, half Acoma. So I wanted to welcome everybody. I received my master's in social work from Arizona State University. Go Sun Devils! And so just wanted to welcome everybody. So excited to present this evening, and looking forward to some great discussion.
Great, thanks, Kelly. I realized I said that I was on the Optum Druid and I was using another language. So for me, I think it's really important. When I talk about Optum Druid, that means I'm acknowledging Thana Optum land. And Druid is land. So when I say that to you, what I'm letting you know is that at all times I work respectfully, with responsibility, in reciprocity, and in relationship with the Thana Atam Nation and the Pascua-Yaqui tribes. And this is reflected in my work, in my social work practice, is I'm not simply giving you an empty statement about like my location, but I'm actually telling you something about my practice. And so that was just summed up in, I'm coming from the Atam Druid. That was like shorthand. Longhand is that type of acknowledgement. So, I'm gonna take a moment because, Kelly and I have the floor today. And I think people like to talk about land acknowledgements. Universities are really like, they love to do that stuff. And, honestly, as a social worker, if you're not living that, you don't really need to do that, so be authentic. If you're going to give a land acknowledgement statement, think about the relationship you have. It's cool. If you don't do it, that's fine. I don't think it needs to be something that's said all the time. If that's not where you're at, if that's not where your social work practices is at, if that's not where your agency's at, don't make up some words. Like, you don't have to do that. I think in many ways that's an inauthentic way, and that kind of defeats the whole allyship thing, you know? And I think labor acknowledgments are every bit as important, you know? So while I am not particularly in a space that had African or Asian labor, forced labor here, so I don't necessarily make that acknowledgement in my particular space, but I do think it's important for other people's space to totally have that acknowledgement as well. So, but again, it's where you're located. So thanks for giving me a second on that soapbox as I kind of leading through a grounding. But Kelly, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh no, you said it perfect. But as you know, as far as land acknowledgement, to to Melody's point, it's just our way to also provide that respect on the land that we are on. Within the Southwest, it's totally different. As Melody was saying, we have vast amounts of land. And each one is kind of just like cut up. So so some like 1 foot will be here and 1 foot will be there. So it's just our way of respecting one another. And it's also our way to show that we're not all categorized the same. Each area has its own story. Each area has its own dedication to its people, and it does have its own population. So so thank you for, allowing us to express that and allowing us to share that with you. I do want to give a little disclaimer. A lot of the way most of the time when we speak from it may sound like we're speaking slowly, or it may sound like we're speaking, just from a space of where we're just talking slow or talking, not talking as fast, but it's a way for us to help process along when we're speaking. It's a way for us to tell our story more clarified and more accurate. And sometimes there's also a time where after we're done speaking, we'll just pause. And, I like to call that the native pause. It's not that we're not acknowledging what you're saying. It's not that we're not going to respond. We're giving ourselves time to process what we've heard and provide that appropriate, or if necessary, feedback. And so when you're working with an Indigenous population, you'll notice that a lot. And that's why it's very important to understand that a lot of Native Americans / Indigenous people, they have that storytelling way of speaking. So I just wanted to let that be out there.
Awesome. So I'm going to lead us through our opening grounding, which is kind of a reminder. I know some people here I've seen your faces, I'm familiar with you, and other ones who might be new tonight. We kind of start off letting everyone know that this particular space, this town hall, is about BIPOC participants sharing stories. So we ask that our white participants listen, because, listening is a form of participation. And, active listening is super important. I think it's a great skill as a social worker. A lot of people always ask, well, what do BIPOC people want? And this is your time. You can learn right here. And if you have a question, feel free to throw that in chat. We'll be responding. We have Olivia and Sam that'll be bringing attention to us, because Kelly and I are kind of storytellers. So we need to be brought back into answering questions, because we're here for that. And I want to acknowledge that with this topic, as most social work topics, this can be a space of discomfort. We're learning how to engage in a dialogue together. So we're going to embrace that discomfort today. And I think that's really important, to give yourself that space to feel that way. We encourage participants to keep their cameras on. Our conversations are vulnerable. And so sharing to blank screens, that can be really difficult. And so again, in these difficult, uncomfortable spaces, we encourage you, if possible, to put your cameras on. So take care of yourself as you need to during this time. We encourage you to share resources in the chat. So that's important. I think we learn a lot from each other during these town halls. Everything we say here is confidential. I know it's being recorded, but this is something you don't want to take about sharing names of agencies. You may want to be careful with that. Supervisors, colleagues, clients, you want to protect yourself and others because people can view this at a different time. There may be things that are said tonight that can offend people. This is a brave space. I don't like safe spaces. I like brave spaces. And this is a brave space here for those to have conversations. So just think about that. Tensions may arise during this conversation. I know I am already feeling some tension around the whole conversation of body sovereignty. So that's how we react, is to understand our triggers, and to that, knowing that as we're uncomfortable, we're growing together as we all share different opinions and ideas on the topic tonight. The idea here isn't to argue, but to move forward with understandings. And I would say Kelly and I were really big on, let's just try to focus on solutions tonight too. Let's really look at how can we do it. We know there's issues, but we really want to talk about solutions and learn from each other. So with that, Kelly, I think is going to give some principles of the community.
And thank you for that, Melody. Thank you for sharing that space with us and sharing that information. So we're going to go over the principles of the community. We are first going to recognize that we must strive to overcome historical and divisive biases, such as racism and sexism. In regards to this topic, we're going to be exploring a conversation of discomfort. And so to Melody's point, if you feel like this might be a triggering conversation, or if you feel like, you're having a little bit of feeling of overwhelmed, so you can turn your camera off and kind of step away and then return to the conversation. We want to also acknowledge that we are systematically taught misinformation about our own groups and about members of other groups. So this is also a time and space to listen. Active listening is very important, as well as social emotional intelligence. So being aware of your emotions, being aware of others' emotions, and then also practicing that amongst one another. This is a space of not blaming. So this is a no blame or shame space. This is also a space of open conversation. If you do have questions, or if you do or are curious or want clarification for BIPOC, you may unmute yourself. And for those that are non-BIPOC, you can put your questions in the chat box, and we will make sure that we clarify any misinformation that you've been informed or taught or heard. We're also about respecting. So we agree to listen to each other respectfully. We agree to listen and to provide that respect for one another. And this is making sure that we're creating that safe space for not just yourselves, but for everyone participating, for everyone who are feeling vulnerable, overwhelmed, or even feeling that traumatic experience or processing, being able to respect that space. We also want to encourage individual experience, being aware that not every person will have that same experience. Not every person will feel the same about the experience that they've had encountered. And so just having that respect and respecting each other's experience when it comes to what discussion we're talking about. Also being able to trust, so to learn, to grow, to share, a confidential space. Some of the stories that we're going to tell are going to be stories that are lived and lived experiences. So being able to keep that confidentiality, being able to keep that trust, and I know we are all really good at that. Also sharing the air. So include other voices in a discussion. Be okay with disagreements. Be okay with not having the same viewpoint as the other person, because the more we practice that, the more we get to learn about each other. We get to learn about the other's perspective, not so much that you disagree, but you're like, I see, this is how they think. So of course you're going to probably meet other populations that think probably the same way, and at least now you know how to lead off a conversation. also understand that we are not experts. We are also talking and discussing from our own lived experiences. So a lot of the stories that you hear is from our own Indigenous culture, our own traditions, and also, what experiences what we lived, during these times. Also ask for help. And this goes back to the conversation of clarification of information, curiosity, and whatnot. And so that ends for the principles. And so, and again, if you guys have any questions, any comments, any feedback, feel free to, utilize the chat, raise your hand, or just unmute yourself.
All right, thanks, Kelly. So we thought deeply about what kind of topic do we need to discuss. And I don't know how familiar people are with the concept of body sovereignty, but that's something I've been working in for decades as I've worked in anti-violence in Indigenous communities. And so originally what I learned about body sovereignty is the right of people to have control over what happens to their body, whether it be domestic violence or sexual assault. That's kind of where I began to learn about body sovereignty, is understanding and acknowledging a person's right to determine what happens to them. And this world has gone wild in not understanding that concept. And this is something we talk about a lot. And so originally, Kelly and I are both part of a group called the Honor Collective, which is Healing Our Nations, Offering Resiliency. And this collective, we do community events. And Friday is Orange Shirt Day. Orange Shirt Day is actually began in Canada and is going out through the Americas right now in regards to survivors of boarding schools. So I am not sure. It's great because everyone I see on camera is like, yes, I know what boarding school is. But everyone who's not on camera, I don't know how familiar you are with boarding school. So I'm just going to briefly acknowledge that boarding schools were a place of incredible intergenerational trauma for tribes throughout the continent, but also, frankly, in Maori, in New Zealand, in Australia, other places also had boarding school environments where the Indigenous children were sexually abused, physically abused, were not able to practice their spirituality or eat their traditional food. So all the 4 ways of well-being, emotional, physical, spiritual, and mental, were all greatly disrupted for a few hundred years through, in this case, the United States boarding school process, which was government ran, government funded, given out to various religious organizations. And so they literally divided up the country. And so Catholics got this part of the country, and then Mormons got that part of the country. And so, things like that. So it was a wide range of Christian religions that all pretty much did the same thing. And currently it started in Canada, where they started recovering the bodies in boarding schools. They already have graveyards, by the way. So we know and understand that our children died there. But there's actually some that they've uncovered hidden graves. And so Orange Shirt Day is an acknowledgement of that. And so, as you can imagine, body sovereignty and the murder of our children is really like just foremost on our minds right now. And so that was just something like, we need to talk about body sovereignty because that's our Indigenous understanding of it. But we know that there's definitely an African-American component of body sovereignty and how are Black bodies treated. And I use the word true spirit, but LGBTQIA+, there are some issues with body sovereignty and law right now for that community. I mean, there are just all kinds of issues in body sovereignty. It's just boiling, not to mention the Dobbs decision. And the NASW had a really amazing 2-part series on what can we do as social workers, how to handle all of that with birthing persons. And so I think there's like so much to unpack with body sovereignty. That's part of the discussion. Kelly, is there other discussions that we need to have before handing it over?
Yeah, thank you for that, Melody. Going back to, body sovereignty and the Indian residential schools, that was all a part of, the manifest destiny that was brought in. It was all about assimilation and colonization. And a lot of this overlaps with one another. My experience with body sovereignty actually started on a more positive aspect than it is now. Now, body sovereignty is used as a fight for the right kind of campaign. And I'm saying campaign because right now, with what the discussion we're going to have is, but my experience and my first telling, if you will, about body sovereignty started through, when I was a little girl. My family is very, very cultural and traditional. So we participated in a lot of ceremonies as a part of being, a Navajo Diné woman. Going through the puberty ceremony was a part of a rite of passage, if you will. And we call that the kinalta. And within that kinalta, we are just our elders, the elders around me, specifically the women, discussed to me about how my role as a Diné woman is important, and what about me is special, what about me is sacred, and what about me is precious. And so at an early age, I was taught what my body sovereignty is and what control of that is. And in our culture, we call that it has to come from you. It is within you. Only you make the change. Only you make that. You're in control of your own destiny. So when it comes to body sovereignty, that was my positive experience. However, as I was growing up, you see about, domestic violence, you see sexual assault, you see alcoholism, you see a lot of the negatives, social problems, social challenges in all communities, and with what I've seen in our community as well. And so I've seen and it was a culture shock to me, seeing my personal experience, seeing my aunties get hit. I'm just like, oh, you're not supposed to do that. Grandma and grandpa said this. And, it was a definite culture shock for me. And to tell you the truth, it was a traumatic experience. Me and my husband were just having a conversation. We were talking about what is traumatic to us. And from witnessing all of that, my traumatic experience is I freak out or I get anxiety when I hear men speaking loudly. And it could be them laughing loudly, it could be talking loudly. And that was, that's my traumatic experience, is when that would happen, usually my uncles would start, getting physical. And so a lot of that has to, it intertwines, it overlaps with, the residential school, the children, how they were treated, what was known to them and what was not known to them. So having that traumatic experience, being in residential schools of physical abuse, sexual molestation, sexual rape, you can just imagine what that might have felt for them, knowing that traditionally that's not what you're supposed to do. So I kind of just wanted to share that experience, and that, that story about how I grew up. And I'm not saying I grew up in just really bad. It was just family dynamics and relationships within my family. So I just wanted to, thank you for letting me share that.
That's great. I think I'd like to open up with just if anybody would like to share their concepts of body sovereignty with us. Just go ahead, raise your hand, unmute. Okay, I saw Eddie unmute and Felix raise their hand. So Felix, you want to start?
Eddie can go first. That's fine.
You all are brilliant, so it's all good.
Go ahead, Felix. I want to, because I talk too much. I want to make space for you.
I talk too much too. I'm usually the first one speaking. So, but I'll go first because my mic is on now. But I definitely do have like I talk a lot too. So I appreciate the space though. So body sovereignty, like I'm thinking about it a lot and like in the perspective as a social worker. So as a social worker, I practice at a small group practice as a psychotherapist. So body sovereignty, like I think that therapists in particular are really bad at it. The rightful stereotype that therapists have is like the moment a client mentions that they're thinking of like suicide, their body sovereignty taken away, involuntary hospitalization, all of that stuff. And I think that's really concerning, right? Like I have had to I recently had a client who my spiel is very much like, by the way, you can mention this, this, and this, and this in session, and I'm not gonna call the cops on you, I promise. Like that's essentially my spiel as an abolitionist therapist. But even still, it takes forever for my clients to trust me around this stuff, to like where they're asking questions like, what would you make me go to the hospital if I told you I was cutting myself? I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, let's talk about it. Like, it's fine. Like, and the thing is, like, I think the big taboo about body sovereignty as a clinician is that my clients have the right to hurt themselves. I can't do nothing about that, right? I can offer them other like things, I can hold space for them, but ultimately, if they're going to choose to hurt themselves, I have to hold space for that. And there's no way I'm going to involuntarily hospitalize someone because of that situation. So that's like the big first thing that I think about when it comes to being a therapist, which segues to another body sovereignty thing. Personally, in my opinion, I think if we care about body sovereignty as social workers, we also have to be abolitionists, because prison is like the ultimate taking away of body sovereignty, specifically for like predominantly like Black and Indigenous and like other folks of color. Like that's a serious issue, and we can't pretend that social workers are not a part of that problem, because we absolutely are. So that's a big value of mine. Like, we think about body sovereignty, immediately we have to be abolitionist about these kinds of things. And then particularly the way that I practice as a queer and trans social worker to mostly queer and trans clients, many of them are fighting to get gender affirming care. The fact that I have to write letters is fucked up. It's just fucked up. Of course I do it, right? And I try to go in an informed consent way as much as possible. So for anyone who's working with trans clients, the general like standards of care by WPATH is a gatekeeping model in which you have to write a letter to basically say this client is trans enough and deserves gender affirming care, plus they have to be their mental health has to be reasonably well controlled. Mentally ill people also deserve gender affirming care. Like, it just means like, how do we support this person more, kind of thing. So the system that I work in is not set up for the body sovereignty of my clients. And unfortunately, if I don't do my job and work within that system, writing those letters, my clients don't get surgery. So I have to. I mean, I try to do it so that their experience is as much about their informed consent rather than me gatekeeping as much as possible. And then that way my clients get an experience and I get to be the navigator of the shitty system for them, because they shouldn't have to deal with that kind of thing. So those are three immediate ways I think about body sovereignty. And I think that therapists are a huge problem when it comes to those kinds of situations. And I try my best to mitigate that as much as I possibly can.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Felix. And Eddie, we'll go to you next. But I did want to kudos for pointing out the system structure. I feel like that also is a barrier and a challenge, especially within Indigenous communities. That's something that we continue to talk about. And that was one of my biggest things when I was an intern for Melody, was just pretty much like the system. So it's one of the things that I agree with when you were talking about gender affirming care was, you know, we thought the same thing as well. Is like, why do we have to give the okay when saying that they're mentally stable, that they're mentally able and capable of getting, you know, to start the gender affirming care. But you're like, well, that's why they're here, because they're having issues with what, you know, their identity is now. They're having issues with the way society is, you know, treating them and stereotyping them and whatnot. And so, no, they're not mentally stable at this point, because this is what the barrier is for them to feel whole. So thank you so much for pointing that out. And I really appreciate that you did bring up that, you know, the system of care and how it works, because as a, you know, an Indigenous person, mental health and westernized concepts just don't go together. You know, our spirituality is our strength, but if we're having ceremony, if we're having, you know, our processing, we're told that we're having, you know, psychotic breakouts, we're having hallucinations, we're having, you know, all of these things, and then we're categorized, you know. So it's been that way, at least within Indigenous populations as well. Eddie?
This is why that's why I roll with Felix. Because sympathetic vibrations. When I heard body sovereignty, the first thing that came to mind was you are not really pro-choice if you are not pro-suicide. The reality is that all of the systems that we have are colonial systems, many of which mimic carceral systems. And I think that when it comes to body sovereignty and Indigenous peoples and Native individuals, as a Maya person, you know, suicide has always been revered in our culture because we see it as going into a divine space, like the colonial binary that once you die, you're done and you're just thrown into the ground and just take up some more space, right? Consuming space, even in death, still needing more. You know, I think that when it comes to these concepts of body sovereignty, I think it's important that we also remember that we cannot, quote unquote, decolonize them. And even with that, I hate the word decolonize in terms of concept, because to decolonize is to give back the land. We are de-Europeanizing these concepts, and we need to eradicate them completely and re-indigenize a lot of the ways that we experience this, because suicide amongst many Indigenous peoples, including our relatives from the continent of Africa. Let's remember that Black USians who were Afro descendants are Indigenous peoples. They were detribalized, they experienced violence, and they were brought here. And even historically, the Igbo tribe who overtook the ship, who destroyed their colonizers, and as a mass tribe walked and committed mass suicide in the ocean, which is so hidden, right? But I think that when we think about right to life, we must also think about the right to death. Because when it comes to these colonial systems, literally look at New York. People are destroying trees and parks and wildlife left and right. Ecosystems are collapsing for another high rise. But then when individuals who are like, you know what, I no longer want to participate in your colonial system, I'm just gonna, you know, enter the water, as we say in Maya tradition, I'm going to cross over. We want to put them in another system where we can benefit from them, because we know that mental health industrial complexes exist. Now we have the holistic healing industrial complex that is here, right? Everybody wants to smudge, but that's another conversation. So it's really like, in my thought, in seeing the hypocrisy and incongruence in our profession, we will literally put someone on death row, and then if they decide to attempt suicide, resuscitate them to kill them later. It makes absolutely no sense. And I think that there was a great book that I read that really opened my mind a lot more to these concepts, and the book is called The Ethics of Killing. Read that book, because it talks a lot about, you know, body sovereignty in the context of abortion, body sovereignty in the context of euthanasia. And I think that essentially where body sovereignty comes down to is the conversation of consent. It's all about consent. And once we start to go down that rabbit hole, we already know that there are so many different things and taboo things that people are not wanting to address, but it's coming. And so I yield my time, but I'm so happy just to piggyback off of you, Felix, because that is exactly where my mind went.
I love these different ways of understanding body sovereignty. We are so here for this conversation tonight. I want to definitely make sure I open the floor to other people's understandings and even questions you might have. You can go ahead and raise your hand. You know what? Everyone's processing, Kelly. That's what's happening.
This is the native pause I was talking about. So right now, in this conversation, in this space, we are native pausing, which is fine. I mean, this is a lot to take in, and I agree with both Felix and Eddie. These are conversations that, we have in Honor Collective as well. And these are conversations in what it is that we do, and how do we help heal the people? How do we help heal the community? And so yeah, it is a lot to process. It's a lot to think about. It's a lot to to even say, like, how do I even respond to that, or how do I even provide feedback? But in regards to just what Eddie and Felix felt or has said, spoke about, what have been some of your experiences in the system? What have been some of the encounters that you've come across in your field of work? And I think, with what Felix has said about, with social works, I think there's also a lot that's been happening. Social work has grew in a lot of, what it is that we focus on, whether it's theory, whether it's framework, whether it's, just anything. And so I think within social work, it's a lot to process and take in, because we're now having new younger generation learn about social work and its importance and its challenges. But we also have the old school social workers who have a different concept, who come from a different time, come from a different background. And in a sense, you want to talk about it being traditional social work, where it's really hard to change the minds of traditional social workers when it comes to, I'm not saying body sovereignty is not a new concept, but it is now a new focus of conversation. So being able to now say, hey, that is my body sovereignty. Hey, you cannot do that to me. And with older social workers who've been in the game for so long, who've had this array of systematic structure, and it's this way and not that way, it's really hard and it's very challenging. And I think that's where the frustration comes in, because we have these, younger, I don't want to say younger, but like we have more social workers who are educated in these type of focuses, who are like, who are dedicated to learning about these different types of focuses. But then it's that, the old school traditional, this is just the way it is kind of concept. And so, yeah, so thank you for letting me share my feedback.
I think that's a great question, which is, we heard a little bit about, oh boy, I did not type well, about how do body sovereignty issues impact your practice. And I really I'm like from the same place as Felix, which is like, I have worked in some very dreadful systems, and I was there to help usher in as much as I could for my clients. And, sometimes that's what we do as social workers, is we make the best experience in a difficult system fraught with people who don't understand, who don't understand the impact of issues for clients. And so that's how I dealt with it, was at the early stages of my career, was being that one person but I would be real curious. I'm going to also read out some things here that were in chat, which was one about I had to train my native son to not tell his European therapist certain things. Ooh, I hear that one. I knew they would not understand our culture at all, would pathologize our normal. Yes, yes, there's that about, so how, and what is that like to have to be, especially as a professional, to have to train your own family members? I want you to get services in this way, but you can't ever fully trust in that way. That says a lot about our profession, you know, and about respecting them. And then I hear another one about the conversation about body sovereignty with vaccinations among group. That's right. So that's how some people are viewing body sovereignty, which I think is an interesting dichotomy. And I just again have to say, from an Indigenous perspective, like all the statistics have been out, like our communities were decimated. We had tremendous amount of deaths. So vaccinations, and where does somebody's right to not be vaccinated help not kill my elders? So that's a body sovereignty issue, right? You know, how much do we want to tell one person for another person? To me, I do draw the line at death, at imminent death, after tremendous loss of my community. That's my personal take. And so I'm at home alone. Woo, I have some cats, so I'm not masked, but I'm masked everywhere else, even in small intimate groups of 5 and 10. And people sometimes, when I'm in non-native communities, they are always wondering why I mask, and they get nervous. And I'm like, this is to protect you. My community is still suffering. So I'm taking that on. Is my body sovereignty says, I do this to protect you. You mask or you don't mask, that to me shows how much you respect my community and how you show reciprocity for compassion and death. So that's just my little thing. And I see that Eddie has his hand raised.
Yeah, I think when it comes to body sovereignty and vaccinations, I think it's interesting because I spent some time in the Yucatan with, you know, my Maya people. And one of the first things I asked my elders was, you know, did y'all get vaccinated? Because I was really genuinely curious. You know, they have always been in this community. They still practice with the ways that have always been. And when my elders told me, I was expecting them to say no. But they literally were like, you know, everything has its limits. Even our medicines have their limits. Western medicines have their limits. And we have to get to a place where we understand that one hand washes the other and both wash the face. But because of colonial violence and trauma, a lot of Black and brown folks are running from one complete polar extreme to the other. And it's like, I've heard some of my counterparts be like, oh yeah, if I just eat white grapes, I won't get cancer. I don't have to go to the doctor anymore. I don't have to get vaccinated. And it's like, yeah, plant medicines do hold a great bit of weight. And I think it's our job, right, as folks who are re-indigenizing our medicines, to push to get that data out there so we can know what the limits are. You know, but when my elders told me every single person in this tribe got vaccinated because we need to protect each other. And I think that when it comes to the conversation of body sovereignty and vaccination, we have ingested as a society so much white oppressorship culture around individualism. And I don't care what happens to other people. That's y'all problem. So I'm just gonna not wear my mask and cough. And if you know, honestly, I really do think that a lot of Black and brown people do not want to look in the mirror at the way that we perpetuate colonial systems. We really think it's only white people. Sorry, it's not. We do the same thing. We just reinvent it and then paint it Black or brown and then play the victim. I'm gonna just call it what it is. You know, I think that we have to really sit with our race-induced stress and trauma and understand our triggers and really authentically and openly have that shadow work being done. Because so many people are talking about reconnecting to their indigenous ways, but you're reconnecting and taking up space and erasing Native people who've always been there. That's why with me, I always identify as being indigenous and not Native because I did not grow up in my Native community. You know, my family took us out of that. And my great grandmother, you know, she lived and died in the same mud hut on the pueblo that she grew up in. And my grandfather wanted more. So they moved to Guatemala City and then eventually came to the US. But I think that when it comes to this kind of conversation, and I'm very much on the fence, you know, I think that people shouldn't be forced to get vaccinated. And not but, that doesn't mean that you get to come into certain spaces and act reckless and then expect people to be subjected to your level of comfortability with spreading certain kinds of illnesses. I think that we have to find the balance in that, because it really is about balance. The polar opposite scale is not working for us.
Eddie, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And Felix, I do see your hand up. And it's, and I do agree with you, Eddie, but it's all, and it's also about courtesy. And it's also about respect. It's the respect of life. And, when it comes to vaccinations, what I feel usually happens, because I've questioned vaccination, especially with my daughter, she's 15. So she's at that age where vaccination is important. And I do this in quotes only because I've been told this all the time, every time I go to a PCP or medical profession, and that's where to your point, that is where my resistance will come in, because if you're going to stand there and quote at me, I'm going to find that offensive and I'm going to take defense to that. But one of the things is that, I do question it. And it's like, they give me a sheet of paper and it's like, well, read this. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't get what this means. I don't read medical terms. That's not my forte. You tell me what you know about it and why you think it's important for this, and it's like, I don't want to hear what you read on the information sheet. I want to know what you know. And so, and to that point too, it's, there's just Indigenous people and their history with being like guinea pigs. You've got the diabetes research that, blood was stolen from the Indigenous people. You got that sterilization that happened to Native American women and men. You've got, reproductive care. You've got, kids taken away. You've got all of this trauma that's happened within Indigenous communities to our people. And then all of a sudden they're like, you need to get vaccinated because it's very important, because this is what's going to happen, and that's where the hesitation comes in. It's not that we're being resistant to the information. We're being resistant because we lived that experience. And that's one thing that we need to really convey or not really convey, that needs to be understood, is that we are not resistant to the information. We are resistant to the lived experience. Our resistance is what had happened to the people before this information came out. And so thank you for, bringing that up, Eddie. Felix, I do see your hand up. And Melody, did you want to add anything to that as well?
I want to hear Alex.
Yeah, things that I've been kind of thinking about around this and hearing other folks talk is that the balance, like when we live in a society that's so capitalistic, that so breeds like hyper individualism, even as therapists, we talk about self-care more than we talk about community care. And I think it's like extremely important, like, to recognize that community care is so vital in healing. Like, you really can't do it alone. You can't heal relationship trauma by yourself. You heal it through secure relationships. And when it comes to things like vaccinations, that is kind of the definition of community care, right? Because it's not just like you can do whatever you want and it doesn't affect other people. Like, I think that people have the right to set boundaries. So a good example of for a boundary is, like, I see most people virtually, but the people I see in person have to be fully vaccinated and have to wear a mask. Like, is that gatekeeping my services? Is that removing their body sovereignty? I mean, maybe that's like debatable, but personally for me, I have the right to practice my work in the least risk possible and be able to control that kind of and mitigate all of the risks as much as I can, right? Even if it's two people in a room wearing N95s and the windows open, it's still risky, but at least I know that both of us are reciprocating an idea of I'm wearing a mask to protect myself and you, and they're wearing a mask to protect themselves and me. And I think that reciprocity is a really important key to this. And like coming from, so I'm Filipino, my mother is Filipino, my dad is white, and coming from that like kind of almost removed from my culture, the reality of Filipino colonization is that it was extremely effective in making Filipinos believe in American exceptionalism. So they buy into hyper individualism most of the time. So when it comes to like decolonizing all of our things, it's kind of impossible for the Filipino culture, at least from my perspective, to go back because of how successfully they've colonized the mind in both Spanish and like Philippines has been colonized by Spain, Japan, the US, like it's an issue. So when I think about how to move forward, I think about how do we take principles of like things that things that were core values and then translate it into the modern day. Filipinos have this kind of concept, which my mother never taught me Tagalog, which is really, really fucking annoying to me. But that's beside the point. There's a word which I can't pronounce because I don't know Tagalog, that talks about essentially is community care. And it's always visualized in the sense of like in Philippines, especially pre-colonial, but not even pre-colonial, like even recently, they build their homes on like stilts, and the whole village will come together and move another like a fellow community member's house when they move somewhere else. So the whole village is carrying this person's house and coming together for the benefit of another person of their community. And that concept to me is really embodies what community like care is. While individually, maybe it's not in my best interest to carry somebody's house, community wise, I benefit from community healing and community care. And I think that that's a really important part of our social work, at least my social work practice, is focusing on like, how can I understand where my client can get supports from community? How can they cultivate their own community and have those like reciprocal relationships? Because, you know, relationships aren't transactional. They shouldn't be, at least. And if we can cultivate all of those things, maybe people can understand more why vaccinations are a thing, or even why people have boundaries around vaccination. I don't remember the last time I like hung out with someone who wasn't vaccinated, kind of thing, because it's a boundary of mine. And I think that body sovereignty means different things when you're talking to some person of color or someone who is in touch with trying to like decolonize versus someone who's in a colonized capitalistic mind. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And when I say body sovereignty, I do not mean hyper individualism.
I just love everything you said. And I think as we wanted today to be really solution focused, you brought up so many things here, I think, that are just juicy and delicious for me. Like, I think ideas are delicious. And you just gave me like this delicious menu of options of practice. And, you know, that was just wonderful for us all to consider, you know, is collective care. What does that mean? But that discussion about not being in the indigenous space. And so we have people here that are allies, and people that may be further away from their indigeneity. And so seeking to decolonize, or I will say deconstruct where you're at as a social worker in your practice, can be more difficult for people who don't have that experience. So I love what you said and where you start. And I really want that to be such a good template for everyone just to consider and ponder about collective care and about the messages you give as a clinician. That's like so important, you know, as social workers, when we go into school and how we're asked, how we're taught to discuss with clients and talk to clients is so different than in the field best practice models. And that's why I love Revolutionize. That's why I'm grateful for this space, as we all can like learn and grow our menus of how best to relate to our clients. And you know what collective care looks like in a small town in Iowa is totally different than collective care in Los Angeles County, you know, and that's fine, because we're all striving for our best ways to reach out to clients, to support their body sovereignty, to support who they are so they can, you know, find their happiness. So, boy, I just love that. Thank you, Felix. I'm wondering if anyone else would like to share their thoughts on body sovereignty, but and also looking either what it means to you, but also how have these issues impacted your social work practice?
I also want to add, like, we're talking from our experience as being Indigenous and what our history of body sovereignty is. However, we also want to learn from your culture, from your standpoint, from, you know, how you were raised, what was taught to you about body sovereignty, and, you know, and your own experiences. And so don't let us talking about our Indigenous experiences take away and think that that's, you know, the main focus. No, the main focus is body sovereignty in general. And we want to hear about what your thoughts of body sovereignty is and how those thoughts affected you growing up with the culture and all of that. So yeah, just wanted to throw that in there.
Hi, I'm Janetta Christmas. I'm a woman of color. I'm African-American woman. And I just thought I would share a little bit about my experience as a Black woman. For many, many years, and I can think back to, you know, back in segregation, where Black women were teased because they had bigger behinds, or they had full lips, or they had natural hair. And now it seems like that's the trend. I mean, everybody is buying the bigger boobs and the bigger behind and wanting to get the natural hair. And so how do we teach little girls to be secure in their bodies? They may not have a full behind, they may not have the full lips. How do we teach little girls that it's okay to be satisfied with what you were given? And so now, you know, it's everyone wants the bigger behinds and the fuller lips, but that was something that was frowned upon back in the 50s, 60s. So how do we change that? How do we normalize, or how do we get young girls to be okay with, I like to say, with the skin that they're in?
Danita, I am so glad that you brought that up when you were talking about body image, because you just took me back to when I was a little kid. And you know, those teen magazines, you know, like 17 and whatnot, and the whole body image from that to the way it's just progressed to now has been, it's just revolutionized within itself. Like what was liked then wasn't liked now, but what's liked now is no longer, you know what I mean? Like, I totally get it. Thank you for sharing that.
I'd open the floor to anyone who would like to respond, because I'm sure there's some people here that work with kids and thinking about how can we influence that next generation to love themselves.
I think it comes down to radical self-acceptance and teaching radical self-acceptance. For so many of us, and again, it comes down to white oppressorship culture, aspiring to have more, just more for the sake of having it, you know, more butt, more lips, more boobs. And I think it's interesting because there is a return back to whiteness movement that is happening literally right now. Kim Kardashian, all these, Miley Cyrus, all these people who got all this work done to adopt a Black aesthetic, right? Blackfishing essentially to benefit from Blackness, are now removing all of these procedures because they no longer want the responsibility that comes with it. You know, I think that teaching and exposing our younger generations to real bodies is important, because all we see today on social media is the algorithm of coded bias, whether that's whiteness or it's, you know, plastic surgery, cookie cuttered everything. You know, I grew up in the 90s. I was a 90s kid and a 2000s teen. And I can remember starting to see when bodies started to shift to being this really, really interesting shape. I'll just say that. And, you know, I think that the more that we teach radical self-acceptance, even amongst our community, that you are fine as you are, and not to gaslight yourself into thinking, well, I love myself, that's why I'm gonna get this plastic surgery. No, you don't. Stop lying to yourself. Just start with, I hate this about myself, and that's okay if I don't like this, and I wanna change it. I think that that's how we have to get to the root of our self-hate, is we have to really be honest with ourselves and why we make the decisions that we do, and stop looking myopically at things.
I think also with that is this, so I think something that's rooted here that's really important is like, when Melody said, how do we teach the next generations how to love themselves? My first thought was next generation. What about our generation? We don't love ourselves. And then to me, I thought, oh shit, we have to model it. We have to find the love within ourselves in order, because like, where did I learn my internalized fat phobia? From my mother. Like even small things she didn't realize, right? I remember she'd be like, oh, I'm getting fat, or do I look fat in this? Like, which is very common things that people say that, you know, but what it is like not only a systemic fat phobia that comes down, it's also the interpersonal relationships with the people that you look up to. Like in my case, it was my mother, right? Like it taught me very, very much that like, oh, you know, this is not how I'm supposed to be. Like if she made a comment like, oh, you know, you're 12, but like my clothes from when I'm 22 don't fit you anymore. That's weird. Like that kind of thing is like, ooh. So children learn by watching us, right? So like when we think about child rearing, and preface, I am child free. I'm never going to have children, but I often as a therapist, I think about child development and, you know, think about children. We think about how we help children learn how to emotionally regulate, right? That's a really important skill that I think is missing here. So like part of self-love is also learning how to like regulate your emotions, understand your emotions, communicating your emotions, communicating. Like if I had the tools to tell my mother when I was 10, ouch, it actually makes me feel bad when you say it's weird that I can't fit in your clothes, your old clothes, because it makes me feel like there's something wrong with my body. If I could have said that to my mother, given my mother, she actually would not have been able to hear it, which is one of the reasons I didn't have those skills. But theoretically, right, if I had those tools, I could have developed self-love much sooner than I did, because I had to do that as an adult, right? So I think it's not only is it how do we love ourselves and then show that to our next generation and breed it in them. It's self-love is more than just loving your body. It's
Right.
also accepting yourself and learning how to regulate your emotions. There's a lot of skills in there that most of us, my generation, the generation above, most of us have missed. We don't have the tools, and many of us don't learn even in our adulthoods. So if we could get those skills younger, and I see children who have been parented with gentle parenting or authoritative parenting, those children have those tools. And it's because they're not being parented through punitive ways. It's the punitiveness. It's my body is wrong. I have to do something about it. I'm going to punish myself. I'm going to, I have to do this thing. If I don't do this thing, then I'm bad. All of those messages that we get as children stick with us. And the children that I see today, the super queer ones, the super trans ones, the ones who have the ability to self-actualize their identities rather than having constantly pushing back on their having pushback against their identities, have a fighting chance against our systemic fat phobia, transphobia, homophobia, racism, all of the stuff that tells us that we're wrong. They have a fighting chance because they have the foundation to be able to stand on their own without like those insidious messages coming in and affecting how they feel about themselves.
Right. So I wanted to share that unfortunately in the African American community, there's a lot of families that are broken. There's a lot of single mothers raising little girls. These single mothers have to work. And so who's raising these single girls or these young girls? The TV. They're watching stuff on TV that's causes them to have a altered perspective of their body sovereignty. So I think it's more than just self-regulation, emotion regulation. I think it's, what do we do? I think we need to go back to the community. I think someone said something about getting the community back together. Let's raise these kids as a community. Let's role model for them how to be comfortable in their skin. And my brother, who has a little girl, of course, he is married and he has a little girl, and he does not allow her to watch a lot of things that are going on the TV these days. He doesn't allow her to listen to certain types of music. And so I think if parents will go back to parenting like they did back in the day, we may have a lot of kids that would be happy and have that body sovereignty. Yes, accountability, absolutely.
Yeah, I would jump in and say I really do think it comes down to accountability, because for many, Black and brown folks, we have always had to depend on our village, whatever that looks like, the block, the church, spiritual groups, whatever it is. And I think that one thing that I see a lot of my counterparts struggle with as parents is when another elder does something that they're not going to do at home, they don't hold that elder accountable. Oh, well, they're just set in their ways, so just leave them alone. And I think that we have to acknowledge even the ageism in that we limit our elders to think that they cannot grow deeper in their praxis of life, right? And I think that we can continue to hold ourselves accountable, to your point, about letting our children be children. These days, I think when it comes to body sovereignty, like a lot of that is people who do have children. And at the same time, I think we have to touch upon the root that a lot of people have kids because they try to fill a void in their life. They want a mini version of themselves,
Right.
And in many cases, when we don't touch that part of the shadow work, the rest of it falls apart. Do you want a child who you can enrich to help lift our bloodline? Or are you just trying to pass down the generational curse to help alleviate the pain that you're carrying?
Right.
I think that when it comes to body sovereignty, And when we talk about radical self-acceptance of the body, we haven't touched it yet, but this also comes down to understanding sex work. Sex work is body sovereignty. And I think, when we were talking about consent earlier, in my graduate program, I worked in a law firm doing forensic social work, and a large population who I was working with were sex offenders. Now, the ironic thing about that was many of my clients were teenagers, 13, 14 years old, who were going through the criminal justice system and being put on sex offender registries for sending nudes to their classmates. One of the largest populations of people getting put on sex offender registries today are youth. And that's because the state still sees that as generating child pornography. And we have to also understand that we, with the system that we have now, are literally creating a whole generation that will not be able to access housing. They will not be able to access higher education. They will not be able to access employment. We have to also think about, what does consent mean? Because in mainstream media, everything from Euphoria to Generation to many of these shows are depicting the realities of under 18-year-old adolescents having sex, particularly with people who are older than 18. And they're advocating for lowering the age of consent. It's so uncomfortable to even think about this. What does this even mean in the terms of body sovereignty? But I do think that it is coming, because when I hear a lot of my younger clients and they're talking about sex in ways that I didn't when I was that age, and these are as young as 12 and 13, the hyper awareness in the media today with sex is just, it's very USian. And because we don't talk about sex at all, we don't do any sexual education, we're, in my opinion, setting up traps for people to fail over and over again, to go and get excessive body work, to where, young girls are literally going, I just think about my trans, relatives who go to these chop shop basement apartments and get loaded up with all kinds of chemicals just to have that aesthetic because they can't afford it. We have to look at access. We have to look at radical self-acceptance. We have to look at reciprocity, community building, accountability. There's so many moving parts. I'm so happy that you brought this up because it's important.
I just also want to touch on something Donetta said as well, which is in social work, we're also fighting against all these really nasty societal norms / media norms. And that looks very different for everyone. And, I just, it's a lot. I do think, while you originally were talking about young people and how do we do that, it does come, let's take that responsibility. As the social worker, as the clinician, as the group leader, as a CPS worker, as whatever your job is that you have here, as the teacher, professor, auntie, sister, uncle, grandpa, whatever role you have, we do need to begin to model being okay with ourselves, whatever that okay is, and starting that community. It starts here. It starts with us. And it starts with us literally here too on Revolutionize, with all the screens showing and unshowing. We need to begin this. We need to start this here rather than also just focus outward, that we need others to do blank, blank, and blank. I think we can take responsibility for ourselves and start role modeling that. Again, in our communities, in our families, in our clients' communities. I just think that's so, so important, because you know what? No little Black girl is going to feel good about her natural hair if every single, what they perceive as middle-class social worker has straightened hair. If they don't see natural hair on someone they admire, they're never going to see it. If that's that issue, I think, and then I know there's pushback from agencies. I know how agencies feel, how the court's going to perceive you. I mean, it's even true in Indian country, having long hair. They see you as a certain way. I would literally put my hair up in a bun so they would not see my hair, my length of my hair. Don't touch my hair. Sorry, it's a real thing. So, they have to see us role model too. And it's restrictive in our agencies, in the communities, in the organizations we represent. So I know there's a lot of uphill battle as I say that, but I also do think that we begin here. And we begin with these conversations and looking at how do we practice, as well as for our allies. Allies, just don't touch your hair. I know it's pretty. I know I look good. So if I was only kidding, I do. I really love myself. But just it's one of those things. Don't touch the hair. You don't need to comment on certain things. If we're wearing something ethnic, you don't need to be touching that either. Although again, my earrings are the bomb all the time, and it's okay. It's okay. You know, if we're like alone, something you want to ask, that's fine, but you don't need to do that. I think that you also need to accept us for whatever we look like. And so if you have, and in honor, we have someone who's transitioning. And so we like are totally supportive of them. Like for me, I've known this person since they were in middle school and now they're a college student. And so like, it's just that love of what they're doing and their transitioning. So I don't ask nothing. I ask nothing about the experience. I'm just saying, you look so great. You are wonderful. You know, just that radical self-acceptance. You know, I just love them for being who they are and expressing themselves and feeling good in their skin. And that's what's to me beautiful. You know, that I feel like they're radiantly beautiful, which I use for male and female, is because it's that inside beauty. And so, you know, that we need to be like that with each other as well. You know, so just want to kind of mention that, touching up on other people's things. We have a good 10 minutes before closing. I don't know if anyone else had anything to share on body sovereignty. Oh, yes, Felix.
Okay, so I have a little thought about what you just said, Melody, because I was thinking, what I was thinking about there is like how we show up as social workers, right? So like I talk about this all the time, my hate of blank slate therapists. I mean, I don't hate them, but I just hate that we were taught that we were just supposed to be the sounding board for people, when I fully well know that my identities and who I am and how I show up into the room is so important. And I knew that like literally like a month into my first job, where I walk into the waiting room to see this 18-year-old trans boy come in. And he looked up at me, and the moment he saw who his therapist was, his face lit up, right? Because I show up in therapy. And one fun thing that has happened recently is that I got top surgery 2 weeks ago, which was really exciting. I'm like still healing. I'm very tender. I'm really happy about it. It's really great. But what that means is I had to have a conversation with every single one of my clients, and I could have chosen to say, hey, I'm just going on medical leave, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. But what I instead decided to do, and I think this is a personal choice for everyone, I said, hey, I'm getting top surgery, I'm going to be back in 2 weeks, I'm going to do a little healing, and then I'll be back. Not only is, especially for my in-person clients, it's going to be a very visible difference. They're going to know. But I think it was important because most of my clients are trans, and I have like lots of clients who are going through the top surgery process as we speak right now. Like someone got top surgery 2 weeks before me. Someone got top surgery this week. I have someone getting a consultation, like that kind of thing. Like we're all going through it together. And I have to bring myself into the room as that person who is a community member. Like, yes, I'm a therapist, but I'm a community member going through something very similar that many of my clients are going through or want to go through. And things like gender affirming care seem so unaccessible to a lot of people, and it is. But when they see their therapist going through it, it suddenly seems more possible. And obviously not every single therapist is going to have the opportunity to go through gender affirming care, and it's not necessarily relevant. But like, think about the ways that you show up in therapy and how your identities can actually mean the world to some of your clients. And I think that's really incredibly important to utilize and leverage, not only for my client, but for my therapeutic relationship, and also for like my own heart, right? Like, because I am a person, I'm a human, I'm going to show up as who I am. Otherwise, I'm not doing an authentic job.
That's great. Felix, thank you for sharing that. And for you to, say like, yeah, as showing that we're part of the community and showing that we are showing up is definitely important. And it definitely it's something that we as Honor Collective go by as well. We go by, respect, and we go by relationship, reciprocity, and responsibility, as well as, belonging and mastery and interdependence and giving. We make sure to live by, that concept, to live by that model, and being included in community. And so that's great. So I see Anna's hand up. So Anna, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. I apologize. I haven't been able to join by video, but I very much appreciate this conversation and space. I've been thinking a little bit about how I wanted to say what I'm going to share, but I'll share that I identify as Mexican American Portuguese, and I've been thinking about being a transracial adoptee who was culturally and racially isolated while being completely whitewashed growing up in a white town as a child. I had no choice in what happened to me in terms of being adopted. And while I had very loving parents, the rupture to being connected to my ancestors and culture has been significant. But how I wanted to maybe connect this to social work practice is I also experienced some harm in my grad school program. You had to interview to be a part of where I was. I forget exactly what it was called, but it was a Latinx program where you went to classes in Spanish, and it was part of a program. And I obviously didn't grow up learning Spanish how I would have, but I still am, very, through 23andMe, I found out I am 73% Mexican Indigenous, which has been important for me to learn. So I've learned to kind of reclaim that part of me. And so when I interviewed for this program, my Spanish, I was very nervous. I had a lot of shame and guilt around my Spanish not being where I wanted it to be. And I got an email saying, you were not accepted. And that was kind of the end of that. So for people maybe to take away in social work programs in terms of access in how you may identify who should belong, and I don't want to use should, but who is accepted and who is included in that, because I went through my grad school program watching a lot of white identifying social workers who had done programs abroad and were fluent in Spanish be a part of that program, while I am Indigenous to being part of the Mexican culture was not allowed into that space. So I did just appreciate sharing my story.
Thank you for sharing, Anna. That's such an important story, and I really appreciate that. In the time we have left, I think I'm going to let Eddie kind of close us out.
I'm very happy that you spoke, Anna, because I know that there is a Latina panel thing coming up. Anti-indigeneity amongst Latin people is abhorrently alive and disgusting. And I think that taking it back to body sovereignty and indigeneity, the one thing that I was also thinking was echoing about presentation, how we show up in spaces and how we have to hold our agencies and profession accountable for the social eugenics that they perpetuate. Proximity to professionalism. If somebody has tattoos or this or that, I'm on the verge of getting some face tattoos because I'm about to reconnect in that way. I really don't care anymore at this point. This whole society can drop on its head. And I think that a lot of us use the term ally, which is cute. I want to push us to go past that though. Because an ally, in my opinion, regardless of what it is all performative. Like we talked about land acknowledgments earlier. It's the most performative thing. My college at the graduation had a whole land acknowledgement to Lakota tribes and all these people. And then the keynote speaker was a Fortune 500 company person talking about how we need to have more capitalism. It grinds my gears in so many ways. And I think that really, if we want to de-Europeanize concepts, think about decolonizing land and giving it back to the rightful owners, not just to, natives on Turtle Island, but we're talking about the continent of Africa. We're talking about all over the place, okay? We must really aim for abolition, because an ally would like to slowly take things apart and keep certain things, and that's not liberation, that's privilege. Latin people who interviewed you, Anna, and we're like, oh, you're not Latin enough because maybe you're identifying with your indigeneity. It pisses me off so much because it's the epitome of whiteness. And it is the epitome of the settler colonialism that we do not want to address. And I'm going to save all my words about that for the town hall anti-racism audit, because I got some things to say. Oh man, I got some things to say, and people are not going to like me, but I don't care. I don't come to these to make friends. So I do end by saying, body sovereignty is important. Sex work is work. You're not really pro-choice if you're not pro-suicide. And may us all just continue to hold each other accountable and grow and heal, because the colonial trauma is real for all of us, including our white counterparts. Because of European universalism, so many of y'all have truly lost your way and really are trying to latch onto some form of indigeneity, which often manifests as appropriation of Black and brown spiritualities. Y'all gotta look into these indigenous European magics. They're there. Y'all too are victims of colonialism. So push back. Let's be abolitionists, y'all.
Perfect way to shut down the house. Thank you. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Felix. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks you, Donetta. This was amazing. I'm so appreciative of everyone who came on today. And I don't know if we need, do we need to close them? I don't know the next date and topic. So if someone from the NASW wants to close us, that's great.
The next date and topic will be posted soon. We have not decided yet. We are going to meet as a leadership team and get that settled out. But of course, keep your eye out on our social media and our website. As soon as we have that settled, we'll begin our promo. Thank you all for joining us this evening. This was a great conversation. Thank you to our facilitators, Melody and Kelly. You really gave us a town hall to remember tonight. So thank you everyone who participated and who listened. Have a great night.
Thank you. I'm glad I joined. I'm in North Carolina, so I'm glad I got a chance to join.